Historians employ many tools to excavate the past. None is more important than the gift of imagination. So try for a few minutes, at least, to imagine yourself in James Monroe's America. More precisely, in James Monroe's Washington. The city is recovering from its sacking at the hands of the British. It has acquired a fresh coat of sophistication, but it's mostly cosmetic, like the whitewash applied to the president's house to obscure the fire marks left by the British when they burned the place in 1814. And that, of course, is where we get the term the White House. Monroe's America is at peace with the world and with itself. The French Revolution is a fading memory. Napoleon is caged up on St. Helena. Perhaps as a result, the Monroe years have traditionally been seen as an uneventful period of transition from the Jeffersonian Republic to the Jacksonian democracy. If you want a recent parallel, think of Dwight Eisenhower. From the agony of the 30s, the tumult of the 40s, the chaos and creativity of the 60s, what sticks out like a sore thumb, the relatively peaceful, placid, prosperous, gray-suited 50s. Except if you're going through the chaos or the tumult, the 50s don't look so bad. Likewise with James Monroe. In fact, it's a time of dynamic growth and ceaseless change. In Monroe's first term alone, 4 new states joined the Union: Indiana, Mississippi, Illinois, and Alabama. And by the way, keep in mind, 2 of them are northern, 2 of them are southern. Life sped up for Americans. A steamboat for the first time plied the Mississippi from New Orleans to Cincinnati. New Yorkers began to burrow into the earth, digging the Erie Canal that was to be the making of New York City. Young America moved relentlessly forward, presided over by a symbol of past glory. James Monroe is the last American president to wear a cocked hat. Notwithstanding their earlier differences over the French Revolution, and they were profound. In fact, Monroe had been fired as this country's ambassador to Paris by George Washington because Washington believed he was too sympathetic to the revolutionaries. For all of that, Monroe, particularly as he got older, shared many attributes with Washington. Both men, of course, they were Virginians. Both men had distinguished themselves in battle. Both were more steady than brilliant. And like Washington, Monroe saw himself as being above party politics. This was made easier by the fact that he presided over essentially a one-party nation. Adding to the parallel, Monroe emulated Washington's far-flung travels, advancing national unity by appearing before his countrymen in his favorite role as venerable patriot. Monroe, in 1817, paid a visit to Haverhill, Massachusetts. It's up in the North Shore, not far from the New Hampshire line. And it just so happened that his visit coincided with that of a visiting circus. 9-year-old John Greenleaf Whittier was prohibited by his strict Quaker parents from seeing either the president or the traveling show of wild animals. Walking into town the next day, the future poet came under the impression left in the dusty road by an elephant's foot. Naturally, he assumed that it was the imprint of the President of the United States. Whittier returned home happily convinced that he had seen at least the footsteps of the greatest man on earth. In Boston, a city less restrained by Quaker virtue, a crowd of 40,000 people turned out to greet the chief executive. It was that same newspaper I mentioned earlier, the Columbian Sentinel, a Federalist paper, opposition paper, that coined the phrase, the era of good feeling, with which Monroe's presidency was labeled gracefully, if inaccurately. For if there is any era in our history more permeated with bad feelings, it's hard to imagine. Like Andrew Jackson a few years later, or Ronald Reagan in our own time, Monroe's popular appeal mystified the political class. With a degree of vindictiveness rare even for him, Aaron Burr labeled the new president as, quote, naturally dull and stupid, extremely illiterate, indecisive to a degree that would be incredible to one who did not know him. Of course, hypocritical, he has no opinion on any subject and will always be under the government of the worst men. So much for the notion of negative campaigning as a modern invention. It would be fairer to say of Monroe that he was a representative man in an age of genius. He has been called the first ordinary man to reach the presidency. Yet his success in that office, I would argue, did as much to validate the democratic principle as any burst of Jeffersonian eloquence or Madisonian profundity. In his inaugural address, President Monroe celebrated an end to partisan rancor in America. This is ironic. His inaugural was the first outdoor inaugural. The reason it was the first inaugural outdoor was because the House and the Senate were unable to agree on where to hold the ceremony. At the same time, members of the diplomatic corps boycotted the event, their rigid sense of protocol unreciprocated by the new president or his advisors. Far from being governed by the worst of men, as Burr had suggested, Monroe, like Gerald Ford in our time, was secure enough in himself to surround himself with advisors of more glittering talents and more transparent egos. For example, his appointment of John Quincy Adams as Secretary of State pleased Thomas Jefferson, who knew both men. In Jefferson's words, "They were made for each other. Adams has appointed Penn. Monroe has judgment enough for both and firmness enough to have his judgment control." Like many men who have lusted for the presidency, once he was there, Monroe suffered at the hands of others who wanted his place while lacking his perspective. His amiability was famously put to the test when his Secretary of the Treasury, a man from Georgia named William Crawford, rudely challenged him over some federal patronage. A provoked Monroe raised his voice. A violent Crawford raised his cane as if to strike the chief executive. "You damned infernal old scoundrel," cried Crawford. Seizing a pair of fireplace tongs in self-defense, Monroe ordered his Secretary of the Treasury out of the White House. So much for good feelings. We know about this extraordinary encounter because of John Quincy Adams, a front row observer who preserved the Monroe years in the pages of his famous diary. He cannot be said to have been an entirely impartial observer. To Adams, for example, the ambitious Secretary Crawford was, quote, a worm preying upon the vitals of the administration. To their dismay, both Monroe and Adams would discover that a nation without parties was hardly a nation without factions. Monroe might be accorded near unanimity at the polls, but he could not repeal human nature. He was very much a hands-on chief executive, just as we've discovered in retrospect that Dwight Eisenhower, the famous hidden hand theory, was much more engaged in his administration than appeared at the time. Same thing with Monroe. Not a single significant appointment, even within his own department, said Adams, was made without the president's direct involvement. Adams might take credit in the pages of his diary for negotiating Spain's cession of Florida. But when the treaty hung in the balance, it was Monroe who took the lead in pressing Congress to approve the deal. And it was Monroe who used his influence to avert Congress from censuring Andrew Jackson after he invaded Spanish territory in 1818. In fact, Monroe himself drafted the diplomatic note to be sent to a protesting Spanish minister. Good reason for that. Monroe was a diplomat. He'd gone to France. He was Secretary of State. In fact, he was so skillful, during the War of 1812, Madison finally got rid of his incompetent Secretary of War, and he made Monroe both Secretary of State and Secretary of War. In a world still hostile toward popular government, Monroe earned respect for the United States by standing on ceremony. Even within the refined precincts of the White House, however, the old man was sometimes called on to play peacemaker. One evening over dinner, the British minister noted that every time he made a remark, the ambassador of France bit his thumb. "Do you bite your thumb at me, sir?" demanded the Englishman. "I do," shot back his Gallic counterpart. With that, the two diplomats put down their dinnerware and rushed out of the room. They were about to fight a duel with swords in the vestibule of the president's house when Monroe appeared, preventing bloodshed by ordering carriages for both of them. He also had, actually, a rarely glimpsed sense of humor. He'd held more offices than any other man to be president. So he was thoroughly steeped in the byways and hypocrisies of Washington. Near the end of a lengthy White House reception, a friend asked the president if he felt tired. "Oh no," answered Monroe, "a little flattery will support a man through great fatigue."